Last time, we saw how Britain's war debts and need to secure its new North American territories led the government in London to seek revenues from its American colonies. With the passage of the Sugar Act in early 1764, the ministry of George Grenville tightened the screws on the widespread smuggling that had characterized the colonial molasses trade. However, Grenville did not intend that the duties on molasses be the only means of getting tax money from the colonies. On March 9, 1764, the very day on which he introduced the Sugar Act in Parliament, Grenville floated the idea of a tax on stamped documents in the colonies. This was not a new idea. In Britain, a tax on stamps for legal documents, bonds, playing cards, etc., had been introduced 70 years earlier during the reign of William III. The express purpose of this stamp duty was, perhaps unsurprisingly, to pay the cost of the 9 Years' War against France. Suggestions that the colonies be subject to a stamp duty had been raised as early as 1722, and in January of 1764, before the Treaty of Paris had been signed, Lieutenant Governor Robert Dinwiddie of Virginia had proposed a stamp tax similar to the one in Britain to pay for the troops now needed to secure Britain's westward conquests. The plan that would eventually become the Stamp Act of 1765 originated from a relatively obscure figure, a Scottish merchant in London named Henry McCulloh. By the 1730s, McCullough's mercantile business had been doing well enough that he had amassed a small fortune. In 1726 he had made the acquaintance of another Scot, Gabriel Johnston, who would a few years later obtain an appointment as Royal Governor of North Carolina. McCulloh, seeing his opportunities, gave Johnston credit, paid his commission fees, furnished his house, and paid for his passage to America. McCullough's interest in North Carolina was land speculation, a pastime of many wealthy and well-connected persons. In 1737 he had obtained for himself a land grant of 1.2 million acres from the Privy Council in London, a tract just under twice the size of Rhode Island, and one large enough to make him the second largest landowner in North Carolina's entire history. When McCulloh received the grant, he forwarded it to Governor Johnston, who proceeded to double-cross him. The lands the governor had surveyed were not the prime real estate along the Cape Fear River that was specified in the grant. Instead, McCulloh received less valuable uninhabited lands farther inland. Enraged at this betrayal and needing a means to rescue his land speculation, McCulloh used his influence with the Board of Trade in London to secure for himself a special advisory position on reforming the broken land grant and quit-rent systems in North Carolina. McCulloh arrived in America in 1741 to execute his duties as special commissioner. Using his public office for private gain, he seemed most intent on securing his land grants and developing a plantation thereon, rather than accomplishing his official duties reforming the broken system. His entire stay in America was embattled, the governor and the other land speculators opposing his aims. He spent much of his time in litigation, being accused of slanders published against colonial land officials. In 1746, Governor Johnston again slighted McCulloh by extending the line delimiting the territory belonging to the Earl of Granville, slicing off nearly 500,000 acres from McCullough's lands. McCulloh would work out a deal with the Earl of Granville to retain his land rights, but by this point his frustrations with headstrong colonial officials and their clear willingness to act independently of, and contrary to, orders from London must have solidified in his mind the necessity of bringing them into subjection to both the Crown and Parliament. He would leave the colonies in 1747, never to return. By that time he fancied himself an expert on colonial affairs, and would publish several pamphlets arguing for reforms which would strengthen the mother country's control over its colonies. In 1755 he wrote, no doubt informed by his battles with Governor Johnston, that, quote, governors have frequently formed connections with particular parties or factions in the assemblies, and so passed laws suited to their private views and interest. End quote. In 1757 In the midst of the 7 Years' War, McCulloh published a work in which he expressed concerns that the English colonies, though more numerous than the French in North America, would waste their power for want of coordination. Not being a native of the colonies, his view of their relation to the mother country generally, and of Parliament in particular, was quite clear. He wrote, "Their general defense can only be made by the wisdom of our legislature, and without such a union it is impossible to make the colonies act with force and vigor, or to oppose the united force of the French, although much inferior in point of number." Thus it was not only advisable, but necessary, that Parliament be the source of defense policy for the colonies. And how was this defense to be paid for? McCulloh proposed several means of raising revenues in the colonies to pay for these troops raised in their defense. One of these was, in his words, to introduce a stamp duty on vellum and paper in America, and to lower the duty upon foreign rum, sugar, and molasses imported into our colonies to 1 penny sterling per gallon. McCulloh's idea that a stamp duty be levied while simultaneously lowering the molasses tax is exactly what the government in London would do 7 years later. Unsolicited, McCulloh submitted his plans to the Earl of Bute in 1761 for his consideration. He, the Duke of Newcastle, the Earl of Halifax, and George Grenville all endorsed the plan, though its recommendations were not acted upon. In July 1763, 4 months after George Grenville had succeeded Bute as Prime Minister, McCulloh once again submitted his plan for a stamp tax, including a draft of the bill. The plan was so well received that he was hired by the ministry to work on drafting the final form of the bill. However, McCulloh was not the only one working on the draft of the bill, and the government began adding clauses which he considered to be exceptionable and which would doom the scheme to eventual failure. The man who argued for over a decade that a stamp tax should be imposed on the colonies was now sternly opposed to its implementation. Perhaps he thought that no law was better than a bad one. His time dealing with the American colonists, frustrating though it may have been for his financial interests, had evidently left an indelible mark on his mind. He knew the temper of the Americans. He pointed out several problems with the bill as adopted by the Grenville ministry. First, the Stamp Act proposed to tax documents coming out of ecclesiastical courts. These religious courts did not exist in America, and many of the settlers had left England for the express purpose of escaping the authority of the established church. Religious persecution was a real concern in the minds of dissenting groups, and the colonies were filled with these: Congregationalists, Presbyterians, Baptists, Quakers, and so on, none of whom were keen on the idea of Anglican clerics extending their authority to America. McCulloh warned that the provision for taxing documents from ecclesiastical courts would be looked upon by the colonists as a prelude to establishing such courts. Additionally, the bill gave admiralty courts jurisdiction in prosecuting Stamp Act violations. Admiralty courts had no juries, and their judges were royal appointees. McCulloh knew that this too would be sure to meet staunch opposition from the Americans. He anticipated their response, in which he said, "The colonies insist that by the above clause they are denied the privileges they are entitled to as free-born subjects of the mother country, that they, as colonists, are entitled to the benefits of the common law of England, and to the privileges granted by Magna Carta." McCulloh summed up his complaints thus: "There could not be a more effectual method taken to render the said colonies in process of time independent of their mother country." His prediction could not have been more accurate. Indeed, when Thomas Jefferson composed the Declaration of Independence, the 18th grievance which he listed against George III was that he had deprived the colonies of the benefit of trial by jury. And so, Henry McCulloh, principal architect and longtime agitator of the Stamp Act, was now warning that its passage might spell disaster for the British Empire, even so far as the loss of the colonies. Notwithstanding these objections, Prime Minister Grenville had decided upon the Stamp Act. And so, on March 9, 1764, On the very same day he introduced the Sugar Act, he revealed, "It may be proper to charge certain stamp duties in the colonies and plantations." He said little more except that the legislation would be postponed for another year, in order that the colonies might bring arguments against it. In his speech, however, Grenville made it clear that the Parliament possessed the right to tax the colonies internally. He would hear no arguments against it. The stage was now set for the rift that would tear the two apart.